Hey, good afternoon. My name is Aldana Allen, and I serve as the pastor of Providence United Methodist Church in Salisbury, North Carolina. We're located near Dan Nicholas Park in a beautiful part of the countryside. It's a rural congregation, and it's just such a great place to serve. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you today about evangelism in a cross-racial appointment. And likewise, I appreciate your professor, the Reverend Fred Jordan, for extending this time to me. Reverend Jordan knows a lot about Providence United Methodist Church. He actually served as the interim pastor here for about 4 months. There was a short period of time between when my predecessor left and before my arrival, and Reverend Jordan stepped in and did a marvelous job helping to bridge that gap. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen with you and do a little bit of a slideshow presentation. It won't be very long. And I also want to share with you the interview that I had with Soledad O'Brien. I was just floored whenever her team contacted me. She had heard about the work that I was doing, the ministry here, and she interviewed myself and my wife, who is Presbyterian clergy, and hopefully that will give you a little bit more insight into cross-racial ministries, and in particular, addressing those more sensitive issues that have come up that I've been talking about through the whole time, but really also came to more of a head this past summer in 2020. So let me take a moment to share my screen with you. So I'm in my 7th year here at Providence, and I'm the first African-American to serve here. Most of my professional ministry vocation has been in cross-racial churches. In fact, out of 20 years under appointment, 18 of those have been in cross-racial settings. I have served predominantly white congregations in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Knoxville, Tennessee, and now in Salisbury. When the bishop first asked me to take a look at this appointment, he was asking whether or not I had served a church that has contemporary worship styles. I said, yes, sir, we've done that in other locations. Well, when I got here, I didn't realize that their contemporary music featured a bluegrass sound. So I have to admit there was still a little bit of a culture shock coming in for me. The opening worship service, we have 2 services. The first one would feature this bluegrass worship. And I have to admit, I scratched my head for a brief moment and said, what have I got my black self into? But of course, the worship isn't about me and featuring me in any kind of way. And so I was able to adapt and to be with the people and to celebrate in the manner in which they are accustomed. We are a thriving congregation, although our numbers did take a hit during the pandemic. We still offer 2 worship services, one at 9 and one at 10:30. But unfortunately, the bluegrass that band has disbanded, and so we're no longer able to offer them as part of that 9 o'clock experience. But nevertheless, we are continuing to find ways of reaching out to the community, like many other churches around us that have come through this pandemic. We have broadened our use of technology, Facebook, live streaming, those types of things. We have returned indoors, masks are required, and we are finding the numbers are slowly, very slowly, starting to pick back up. But as I think about what it means to serve in a cross-racial congregation, there are some basic things that go along with being a pastor anywhere. And so the first thing I would want to mention to you, the first thing that you really need to know is that you have to be clear in your calling, right? So what is God calling you to do? What is God asking you to do? Well, there are some things that are general and across the board. We are called to baptize them and teach them and to equip them and to make disciples. This is the mission that Jesus gave us. But in addition to those specific elements, I found that there were a few other attributes that I was able to bring as a black pastor in a predominantly white setting. So there are 4 things that I would like to lift up to you, 4 parts that I want to mention. And again, I'll just hit these briefly and keep moving. So the first thing I want you to know is that I believe that God is calling me to use my scholarship. God is calling me to teach people in my white context material they might not otherwise be exposed to. I know my predecessors have stood in the pulpit and quoted Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I don't know if any of them have stood up and quoted James Cone. And I believe I've had an impact already. To loosely paraphrase one of my members, she said that she was, quote, So glad to have me as pastor because it means her daughter is exposed to biblical thought coupled with Black brilliance. I take that as a very high compliment. So as part of my calling, part of what I believe is part of the work and the mission that I do is to use the scholarship that I have obtained from Gammon Theological Seminary and from Hood Theological Seminary, since I'm in the DMin, the doctoral program there. Secondly, God is calling me to be a prophetic voice and to boldly decry the injustices in our nation and in our world, particularly to an audience that may not normally hear such a message. Let me quote from J.D. Otis Roberts. He writes, "Whites are often unaware that whiteness is a problem. On the other hand, Blacks discover early in life that whiteness is a problem with which they must deal." And so in addition to the scholarship, there is the boldness that comes along with having the prophetic voice. And again, I realize that that is still a general enough statement that we should be, that's a general enough missional part of our calling that we should be doing in whatever our setting. But I get to speak directly as it relates to racial matters also. Now, I'm encouraging my white colleagues to continue to do that in their own particular settings if they're in a predominantly white setting themselves. And I think that's vitally necessary. But I discovered early on for me that this was a key component of what I felt like my calling was in a cross-racial context. I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint. Unfortunately, the video couldn't link through the PowerPoint, so I have to stop sharing this and then reconnect you through the Soledad interview. So I'm going to share the screen again. All right, so we'll take about 5 minutes to listen to this.
In 1963, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "It is appalling that the most segregated hour in Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning." According to the Pew Research Center, that's true today. About 8 in 10 Americans attend services in a church where a single racial or ethnic group makes up 80% of the congregation. 2 pastors we met in North Carolina, husband and wife, are seeking a path to racial reconciliation, each with their own congregation, one predominantly white, the other predominantly Black. We call this story Revelations. God sent his son. They called him Jesus. In-person Sunday services have finally resumed at Providence United Methodist Church in Salisbury, North Carolina. But social distancing wasn't the only adjustment this church had to make in its near 200-year history. Reverend Aldana Allen is Black. His church of 300 members is entirely white.
I was deliberately, as a Black pastor, sent to a white congregation. I believe so that we could continue to foster racial reconciliation.
And what message do you think you're sending when you're standing in the pulpit?
Well, hopefully the first message that I'm sending is that God loves people. We have already begun our... And then also that Black and white both bleed, Black and white both cry. Once I can point toward those commonalities, I can also point toward a common solution.
Reverend Allen was the church's first Black pastor when he arrived 7 years ago. He's used his pulpit to address the national outcry over the deaths of Black Americans at the hands of police officers.
Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and the list goes on. So those are certainly times whenever it has weighed more heavily on me. But I certainly don't want it to come across as reactionary. Because I was speaking to many of these issues well before or even in between incidences.
60 years ago, not far from the church, the KKK had its state headquarters. Today, the county is deeply Republican. In the last election, Donald Trump carried 67% of the vote here.
I did see a need for people to expand what I would call their race consciousness. Let's stand together and sing, friends.
Reverend Allen has organized workshops for church members to help them better understand systemic racism.
We have enjoyed hearing his point of view. We have been able to hear his stories of what he's gone through.
Church member Pam Irvin was among those who signed up for the 9-week workshop.
When he has faced racism, he told us about that when he was younger and was spit on. He's, I think we need to hear those stories, and in order for us to heal as a nation.
But while she went to the workshop, most other church members stayed away.
I think as whites, they feel like, why bring all this up? You know, it was 400 years ago.
My congregation, I think, would be more open to express concerns of race, maybe a little more freer than my husband and some of his members.
Amen. Amen. Somebody shout about it.
Reverend Allen's wife, Sonia Macaulay Allen, is also a pastor. The members of her church, Bellefonte Presbyterian, are mostly Black. What makes it hard, do you think, to be ministering in a cross-racial kind of setup?
Just the difference, just the sheer cultural difference. And then when you end up having to meet the issues around race or have to deal with a national issue that's happening, that has to be, and I know it is, very challenging when that bubbles up.
And when it does bubble up, for the other, Reverend Allen, his job is to lead his congregation toward understanding.
In the predominantly white congregations, maybe they aren't able to grieve it the same way that I am. So at least if they can see me grieving, maybe that starts to make some connection. This is a tragedy of epic proportions, and this does not need to be this way. As followers of the risen Lord, we're called to operate in such a manner that it doesn't have to be this way. Thanks be to God.
So as I said, you have to understand your calling. I understand God is using my scholarship, and God is calling me to be a prophetic voice. Also, some of the things that you heard me mention, even to Soledad. And by the way, it was a very, very long interview. I'm always amazed at what they decide to keep and what they decide to cut. We interviewed for probably 3.5 hours. They interviewed my wife alone for an hour, and I'm sure I was there for at least 2.5 hours. So there's a whole bunch of footage on the cutting room floor somewhere. But I am pleased with at least what they were able to put together. In any case, I mentioned that that I also think that we are called to transcend a lot of the difficulties and the barriers that we see around us. So thirdly, I think that God is calling me to lead my congregation in acts of love and justice. So this means that I need to connect Providence UMC with holistic ministry opportunities. Again, as Roberts puts it, this is the type of love that is not based on sentiment of love or cheap grace. It rests upon the firm foundation and faith in God. So there is an opportunity to step forward into ministries of justice. We do that with programs like Stop Hunger Now, which is called Rise Against Hunger. That name has changed, and several ministry examples I could pull out. And then fourthly, the last thing that I want to share with you is that I believe that God is calling me to engage in the work of pastoring with excellence. So that as I do that, if I engage in pastoring with genuine care and excellence, it will reduce or eliminate the preconceived notions of differences between Black and white. So in other words, the more I can express our existential commonalities, the more I can emphasize that God is the solution to the human predicament. The more I do that, the artificial barriers will fall. Both Black and white bleed, both Black and white desire meaning and purpose in life. Both Black and white have concerns about death. It is through pastoring, through the privilege of being a pastor and walking with people in the most difficult areas of life, that I'm able to gain the trust which comes from consistent care. And that way, I can transcend our superficiality. I can speak to our common humanity and show that there is far more that unites us than divides us. Now, again, I can go into several ministry examples. Reverend Jordan has accused me in times past of going too long with this. So I'll try not to belabor it any further. But again, since we're talking specifically about evangelism, and I wanted to work in the calling sense, but evangelism, of course, involves knowing your context, being there, being deeply immersed, as Bishop Will Lamont says, priestly listening, and just being engaged. And so I've tried to do that. We've had marriage enrichment weekends, vacation Bible school. There have been successes and setbacks in our ministry, a number of things that have gone well, a few things that haven't gone as well. But that's a part of evangelism. That's a part of stepping out and taking those risks. So again, I hope that has given you at least some brief insight. Also, I meant to say the workshops that I conducted for my members are direct relation to my project there at Hood. My DMin project work was to raise the level of race consciousness. That's the paper that I've been working on. So hopefully I will be graduating next spring myself and finishing with this work and be Reverend Dr. Allen next time we meet. I hope that these words have been a blessing to you and help you as you also are considering the ways that God is moving in your life. Remember, you need to know your calling. You need to understand your context, be deeply immersed in your context, and just risk things for the kingdom. God bless you. Bye-bye.